have as my guest tonight Ramon Robinson from Chicago, Illinois, and very excited that he happened to be coming down to this area and agreed to have a chat and build. So this is really, we did this incredible video earlier in the day, which was, I mean, all over the map. We talked about so many passengers. Who did we talk about?
We talked about Daniel Buckley,
Yeah.
Marion Thayer,
Eleanor Widener.
Did we really get into Joseph? Not as much in
No.
that conversation.
Joseph
I think
Baruch.
Masabumi, Hosanno came up.
Yeah.
Fang
Lang
may
came
have
up.
come up.
Yeah.
Rhoda Abbott.
Rhoda
I never
Abbott.
know whether to call her Rhoda or
Rosa. Yeah, I think there was
it's probably
both.
the Encyclopedia Titanica.
Yeah.
Confusing again.
Right.
And did we get Lucian P. Smith?
Yeah. Well, we talked about the officers. We talked about Smith. We talked about
Wild. We talked about. I don't know how Lightoller came up in that conversation.
He wasn't. We didn't talk a lot about him. We talked more about Lowe, and we talked about Pittman. Although I haven't really talked much about Pittman, and we did mention Murdoch.
I feel like we kind of whenever the story of Captain Smith, the apocryphal tale, Captain Smith and the Baby comes up, I'm sort of thinking, are we talking about Sidney Goodwin? Or are we talking about, recently
You're talking about the
Unknown Child.
The Unknown Child, Sidney Goodwin, who they finally discovered his DNA, but you're referring to this, I don't know, allegory. What did you call it? That perhaps a report that Captain Smith took an infant or a baby in his arms and was swimming the baby over to a lifeboat to save the baby. So you were saying you thought maybe, well, first of all, really probably not true, but hey, could it have been Sidney Goodwin?
But I also think, recently I was reading it. Chatter on the internet has a way of causing us to doubt ourselves. Things that we feel that we confirmed to be true long ago. But I was reading something about the baby shoes.
They still
how
have
there were
those.
questions of whether, that the unknown child was really Sidney Goodwin.
Well, didn't they have DNA?
Whether the child who surfaced, I don't know if it was the Mackay Bennett or, whatever ship came upon the child floating upwards first, whether that child was Sidney Goodwin and whether the child with the boots in the grave was also Sidney Goodwin, or were those two different stories?
Yeah, the Mackay Bennett, I mean, that is some dark stuff right there. I mean, for people who don't know, the Mackay Bennett was a ship that the White Star Line actually engaged to go out and to go to the disaster site and recover bodies. And I mean, that just, reading about the people that were in the Mackay Bennett and, what a toll it took on them, pulling, I think it was like 337 or something. And, they had to, describing what they had to do, taking all the personal effects off and putting them in these canvas bags and giving them a name. And then, of course, if they were too degraded, they didn't have room for everybody.
And that's something that is often, it is too disturbing for film. It's too disturbing to portray accurately. I always felt that Cameron's Titanic, that scene, which ended up being weirdly picturesque, for the different movie tie-in books that were coming out at the time.
You mean when the people were bobbing in the water?
The people were bobbing in their blue, and many of them are wearing evening wear. There is something very Hollywood about it. They're glamorous, and yet they're dead, and they're blue, and they're together. And it's just this scene of contrast. What you can see what was happening hours earlier, what their intention was, that they were celebrating. Sunday night on the ship, and actually what became of them. But the reality of what
You know,
happened to everybody is so different. than
this
that.
this
It's so
conversation has
very-
taken a dark turn, but I really think it's something worth talking about because that scene was really, I mean, that grabbed me. When I first saw the movie in '97, those bodies in the water, I mean, it grabbed me because that could have been my great-grandmother there, but for the, grace of God. And so I think also you were talking about earlier, they were celebrating. And one thing I don't know if you know, but my grandmother in her account talks about being at the party. I mean, that party in Cameron's film was a real party that actually did happen in
Steerage
third class.
party.
Exactly.
But that was that Saturday night that happened?
No, it was Sunday night.
It couldn't have been Sunday night because, and this is how I know, because there was that scene the next morning where Cal confronts Rose.
Oh, well, I think, you have Cal was fictional and Rose was fictional, but...
But the party that they are basing that on is a real party.
The party was real, and it happened.
Had people of all different ethnicities and nationalities
playing all kinds of, like bagpipes and homegrown instruments from their various European countries. And I mean, it was supposed to be amazing. And my great-grandmother talked about it, and she talked about being at this incredible party. Think about it. I mean, she was 18 years old, away from home for the first time, and she's having this amazing experience. She's going to emigrate to a continent she's never been out before and knows one person, her slightly older husband, right? And she's got this new baby, and everything must be just mind-bogglingly new, fancy, wonderful, exciting. And she's eating food she never ate before, which was depicted, and hearing all these languages, and it just had to be so exciting. And so she was probably at the height of being so high. And of course, then they kicked them out of the party, I think at 10, something like that. And they all had to go back to their cabins. And, to go from that to someone knocking on your door at, 11:50 or 45 and saying, do you know the ship hit something? And then going through the most extraordinary drama that probably has happened to anybody in generations, certainly my family, and to go from this height to this low. And then, of course, literally fighting for your life to get off this sinking ocean liner, and no moon, 27 degrees. And as you pointed out earlier when we were talking, the ship is now, not only listing to port, but it's also, tilted forward because it was sinking by the head. The bow was already submerged, and, this incredible drama, and then losing her baby, and then looking frantically for her baby, and then finally getting into one of the last lifeboats. And she talks about being either she got in because somebody else got out at the last minute and then she was able to get in, or she was pushed in, or she went in, but and then the lifeboat she was in, she says she saw Captain Smith looking back while the ship was still in sight, and she could see him going into a lifeboat, coming out, going in, and this implication that he was trying to save himself. Which
did others tell that story?
They probably told it as evidence of Smith's heroism, but you have to imagine these women were so traumatized. And the one thing I have to say in gratitude is thank God she wasn't a widow.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if my great-grandfather had been on that ship, she would have been a widow. And, there were, I think, something like 70 or 80 widows, new widows on the Carpathia. And
I'm surprised that there weren't more.
Well,
I mean, there were only 705 survivors, and how many of them were children or, single people.
And crew that didn't have their spouses with them. And there was quite a number of crew. So, they were all pissed off. I'm sorry to use that word, but they were pissed off. And these women were so mad talking about, she even referenced that the lifeboats weren't full, and these men could have been saved, and what a sentence it was in 1912 to be without your husband. It almost was impossible to work as a female in
Although
1912.
one thing, and I know that people don't like us to take it back to the movie,
Yeah.
as it were. But when I think about, fan fiction of the 90s, and, just what would happen to a matronly Philadelphia socialite like Ruth, or like, Eleanor, Elkins Widener, or Emily Ryerson, Marion Thayer, you think, well, I mean, Eleanor Elkins Widener actually had a very rich, adventurous life in the wake of the disaster, in part because she married, I want to call him Alexander Hamilton. His last
I don't
name
think that was
Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton.
I think his last name was Hamilton, but his first name might have been something else. Had a very rich life with this anthropologist, and, Miramar, I think, was her estate in Newport that was under construction, during George and Harry Widener's lifetime, then was finished, afterwards, and became the place where she and, I think at a point Margaret Brown might have had an event there as well. Somebody else connected to the ship had an event at that estate in Newport as well. And her life after the Titanic, as much grief and despair as there was also enough excitement and richness and things to look forward to, that there is a screenplay circulating in Hollywood. It's on the blacklist, supposedly, or so the gossip goes, that is a biopic of Eleanor Elkins Widener.
Wow.
I don't know who wrote it, but she is one who, because she went from being, this leader of society within, the tried and true world of industry, somebody who was from a family of industry, to being like the wife of an adventurer and going on adventures herself as a widow.
She remade herself. She was able to be that resilient.
And she was already in her 50s, which, in 1912, we talked earlier off camera about 50 being the new 35. In 1912, 50 was probably like being 65
at
today.
Least.
At
least. Or older. And, you have to wonder if people were as healthy, just overall, as they might be today. But so I
she
want
lived another 20, 25 years or so.
I'd have to look that up. Not sure.
I think she had a heart attack in a department store.
Say one thing about my Uncle Harry, because people don't talk about him. He was Leah's third child, her youngest child. Something that's interesting is that, and I don't know if you know this, my Uncle Harry was a war hero.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was in Guadalcanal on the USS Elliott, which was sunk, and he had to abandon ship and swim around in, I think, shark-infested waters for a while until they were picked up, and he spent some time on the hospital ship, the Comfort, and can you imagine Leah now?
Having to relive that.
Yeah,
but
and
then
her
you
son.
think about, he wasn't the only one who had an experience like that. You think about Lightoller and
Dunkirk.
Dunkirk.
Oh my gosh!
But they changed his name in the recent Oscar nominated.
Right.
Might have won some actual Oscars. The movie, but we who know the story of Dunkirk,
it's
that
very
that
well
was
documented.
Lightoller, and to go through that
With
and
his
obviously
sailboat,
I feel
Sundowner.
Titanic either prepared him for it, or things that he wished he had done differently.
There you go. I think that's the latter of what you said.
Again,
Well, he was very harshly criticized for interpreting the rules of the sea as women and children only, and he was really, really, very chastised for that, and looked down upon by some people. And
I was reading about that the other day. That was never cemented. It was always an unwritten law. And originally, was it the case that it wasn't about just they're the most vulnerable, so we must save them. It was about well, if something's going to happen to a ship, it's most likely a fire, something that can be controlled. And so we want to get the people who can't help us, just in our very like sexist, misogynistic,
right,
thinking away, so that we strong men can fight, whatever element is
Yeah, and I
putting
heard
the ship in danger
another
without interference and emotion.
saying, if we have to go into the water, we have a better chance of living because we're men and we're stronger, which in reality, it's crazy to think that Titaniacs, which we are both Titaniacs, would actually have this discussion. But how long did it take for people to die of hypothermia in the water, and who would die first? And actually, women would have outlasted men because they have more body fat composition, and the men who would have died the soonest would be people like my great grandfather, who had 10% body fat, who were very lean and muscular.
Had enough to drink, that whatever
right.
Baker Joffin.
Yeah.
Is it Joffin or is it?
I've heard that it's Jockin.
Whatever he was doing to stay. To keep,
but
whatever Frank Prentice did to keep. I think he was also pulled from the water with a bottle of brandy, and whomever pulled him took it out of his pocket and threw it overboard, very angrily, like, oh, well, he's drunk and we have to deal with this drunk man on the ship. Yeah. I don't know if Frank Prentice ever confronted that story. I mean, he told the story a lot, but I can't recall listening to a recording of Frank Prentice's story by him where he, acknowledged that piece of it.
Well, you talked about going to the Maritime Museum and to do some research. I highly recommend it because I'll have to look in my files to see what I have on Frank Prentice and to see if Walter Lord interacted with him, because he did with scores and scores of survivors and got their handwritten accounts, and oftentimes it's thought that those were more accurate because they had some distance from the event, and it wasn't like the prototypical newspaper setting where they were being paid for the account. And of course, early in the century, there was a lot of yellow journalism, and people were, the humanity, and the stokers were coming up with their stoke irons and beating the children down under their feet, and it's thought that the interviews that were solicited by Walter Lord were actually pretty accurate. And
and not even just those interviews. I think once people who he hadn't interviewed heard about what he was doing, they too began to write him, and thought, if somebody's going to help me clarify the story about me that has haunted me for all these decades, it may well be him.
Well, I think he reached out. He was supposed to be wonderful, and people loved him.
I don't know if Alice Cleaver wrote him first or if he wrote her, but I know that there was a letter from her to him where, decades after the fact, she explained, okay, this was my experience of Mrs. Allison, and, this is why I did this thing, and, this is how I actually am, and, just so you know, like, you are getting a letter from a very lucid, stable-minded person, and I would not, do something like what has been attributed to me. I was reacting to this hysteria that was playing out in this room.
Well, I mean, that if you look up the word hysteria in the dictionary, it should have a picture of the ship there. It's funny that we're talking about that because I wanted to touch base with you about how people get interested in the story, and there's so many hobbyists and enthusiasts and people who are just I can't there's not a word to even say how bonded, how in love with the story they are, and so I'm interested what drew you to it.
What drew me to it? I mean, I love telling this story of how I first came into it when I was 8.
Oh.
And my one of my sisters who is now in the film industry,
Oh.
And, it was kind of my door to understanding film, not just as an interest of mine, but as a potential career
Right. Well, you
option.
actually have a degree.
Yeah, I have an undergrad
film.
in films
From Northwestern, right?
And we were in the kitchen. This was 92.
Okay.
And the movie Ghostbusters 2 was
Right.
on.
It had Ghostbusters did have
And
a cameo.
I mean,
of the
she
Titanic.
was very. She initially she studied English at Ann Arbor, but initially in college she would take these communications classes. And this, I went to college in the early 2000s. She was in college in the mid 90s, and in the mid 90s there were all of these aviation disasters happening. And as with now, I'm sure see a lot of professors talking about events of the year, George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, whatever's happening, at that particular year. At the time that she was in college, there were so many aviation disasters: ValueJet, TWA Flight 800, Jessica Dubraff. I mean, so much that was happening that she had taken an entire class that was about communications. In the context of recent aviation disasters.
That was the class?
That was the class.
Communications in
the context of recent aviation disasters.
Wow.
And she would learn would really be reading the what do you call it, the black box transcripts.
Right.
And the trials and whatever other records there were to understand why these events happen and the role that communication played in these events. I tell you that to say, even before she went into college, having this profound interest in tragedy and disaster, and she really passed it down to me. I don't want to say that we had macabre interest.
Well, you were 8 years old, so that's...
I think 8-year-olds are often interested in spectacle. And that is,
okay, all right.
That is why, at the same time I was passionate about Transformers and dinosaurs. Jurassic Park was coming out the next year. And the book Jurassic Park was already out at that point, I think. So anyway, when this scene in Ghostbusters came on, it's that big ectoplasm sequence where the ectoplasm is taking over the city and the woman's wearing the fur coat, and all of a sudden the mates come back to life and they're biting and she's throwing the coat off. Then is it Cheech Marin or Cheech Rivera?
I'm not sure of the name.
Famous actor, the comedic actor of the 80s and early 90s. He and another character actor are, at the docks at Pier 54, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Which in itself iconic for Titanic.
Yeah, it's where the ship. What was the period? Where was Titanic supposed to dock?
I believe it was 54.
I thought it.
And they dropped the lifeboat. The Carpathia initially stopped there to drop off the Titanic's lifeboats, the 13 lifeboats that they had taken. They couldn't take them all, and so they set them adrift. But they did hoist them up in their davits and put them on the deck of the Carpathia and take 13 back to New York. And before they went to the Carpathia's slip, they actually stopped at the Titanic slip and dropped off these lifeboats. And there's a famous picture of them all sitting there in the water.
And yet there's still this, is it a mystery or did we just not document it properly? What happened to those? Can you imagine if the boats were, even if parts of them were found definitively, what a big deal it would be to have that.
Well, some of the plates were found, I think. The lifeboat numbers, and there might be parts that were found. I think eventually they were, some of them were reused on different ships.
It's.
They were brand new.
At the time they weren't thinking, oh, we've had a big museum worthy, disaster.
No, we want to get rid of this stuff and disperse it as fast as we can.
We're going to get sued at big time, and so let's maintain our resources and just exploit what we have left and make good on what's here. But going back to the story of how I came into it, this movie was on and she prefaced it, this scene by saying there's about to be this scene, and what it is 80 years ago there was this disaster at sea, and this ship sank and a lot of people died. and there were lots of rich and famous people on the ship, and also lots of poor people on the ship. And it's going to be coming back in this scene, just watch, and there's going to be this big gash where the iceberg, which of course was a huge inaccuracy that by that point they would have known about. But I think they were probably still.
It was, kind of more of a film adaptation in this.
It was meant to be fun.
It was.
In a way, it kind of made it not be about an actual historical tragedy, but about the mythology of that tragedy, which made this idea of doing a kind of cameo fun scene about a disaster that people who had lived through it were still alive to deal with it.
Absolutely.
I mean, some people who were, I shouldn't say some people, at least one person who was an adult, Marjorie Milrobb would have still been alive.
Yeah, my great-grandfather, he was definitely alive.
People who could remember it,
were
still alive when that came out. And so having that gigantic gash be in the ship, and then having most of the people who disembarked as ghosts, appear to be first-class passengers, made it like sort of a mythology or, another tragedy besides the one that actually happened. I wonder, you hear these things, you're watching it. There was not, as far as I can remember, another Titanic movie aside from the A&E, the two-part documentary, for years afterwards.
How about okay, you mean after that? Because obviously there were many, including one of my favorites, and this is a creepy thing to say, but the Nazi Titanic propaganda film.
Of course, from 1943.
Oh, yeah, I thought that was an excellent film.
Where the director or at least the first director, was killed by the Nazis.
Yeah.
I think it had something to do with his contesting, the representation of Ismay and of other, just the fictionalization of the story. And I don't want to,
Well, I will say to people listening that these are available. Anything that Ramon and I talk about, these movies are, I would say, widely available on either YouTube or Netflix. And the movie a propaganda film that was made by the Nazis in 1941 was a very high production kind of movie, and it had a fictional storyline, just like the 1953 movie did, and the 1997 movie did.
American and British characters as German, which is a huge stretch, but I guess that's how propaganda worked.
Exactly. Well, I said in that
period
movie,
when they had already been sold so much else that was total nonsense.
And then there was the one officer in the Nazi Titanic who was German. Somehow miraculously there was a German officer on the Titanic in this depiction. And he's the only one that had any sense whatsoever, and was also there was a love interest involving him, but
always got to work the romance into the tellings.
Always got to work it.
Speaking of romance, the only I think after I watched that scene in Ghostbusters, I was watching the whole movie, obviously. I thought about it. I mean, it was something that kind of settled into my mind, but there was not, at that point, we were not in a wave of Titanic interest. The waves were sort of, after the initial event in 1912, there was just all sorts of films and literature about it and poems, and so the Lead Belly song.
Yep.
Then the second one, I think, was when the book A Night to Remember came out.
Right.
Then there were two filmic productions, adaptations of the story, one for television and the other one for cinemas. And that was the second wave. The third wave was after the discovery of the ship.
There was the one before they discovered the ship where they were raised the Titanic.
Well, there's that film, but I'm saying waves of just interest where people all over the world were, absorbed in the story of the Titanic, which, it's almost like, I compare it to Pennywise the Clown and It, something that comes and is just really consuming and influencing everything, and then it goes to sleep for 29 years, and, you don't hear as much about it, and then it's awake again. So I would say the third wave was after the discovery, and that brought a lot of survivors who had been previously unwilling to talk about it,
right,
very much out of the woodworks to say, actually, I am this person,
Yeah.
from this event, and
Right.
I am finally comfortable speaking to it because I want to protect, this ship from being pilfered, from being looted.
There is a short, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a short video of my great uncle, and I think it was in 85, and he was talking about, they were asking him, what do you think about this? What do you think about them going down there? And he's like, I just think, they should leave it alone.
Was he sitting in a living room in this video?
Nah, I'd have to
Might be
look back.
Might be another one.
Yeah, but people ask me this about finding it and about what they should do, and I get this question all the time, and I have to say, you know what? I don't think I have the right to say it because thankfully both my relatives survived it. If I had had relatives who died in that disaster, I think they're the ones that should say, because I think legitimately some people do think of it as a gravesite, and I don't want to be the one saying, oh yes, I think you should go and rip off one of the deck houses so you can recover the Marconi equipment and put it with the big piece. Would it be nice to have that Marconi? I fully believe I'm having this conversation with you. If it weren't for that Marconi equipment, I wouldn't be having it. But it's not for me to say. I really don't think it's for the people whose relatives did die on that ship.
I mean, the one part of the, and then I'll get back to film.
Yeah.
The one part of the initial expeditions that I did find disturbing is, I think in 1987, they, were taking objects from the ship, which one can feel one way or another about that. But that they were not identifying where they found those objects, which was really critical
of an
to
archaeological,
understanding what had happened and
sure.
What belonged to who, and what was this actual site. They
where
were
was it found?
For the sake of presenting history
sure.
above the surface to us, they were also erasing history.
Yep.
But going back to films, I would say the point where I really took and became just absorbed for the long term in this was actually the 96 miniseries with Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Yeah, I remember
Gallagher.
that. Yeah, sure, yeah.
Actually, it's another one that's on YouTube.
It is available, yes. And what's it called?
It's just called Titanic.
Titanic.
Yeah.
And it's a miniseries.
It's a miniseries.
Yeah, I'm just saying this for people who might, really want to kind of binge watch a whole bunch of these movies.
And I think it's actually the first telling of the Titanic that shows a ship splitting in half.
Right.
And the portrayal of the sinking, it's a sequence that kind of recalls, we were talking about D.W. Griffith in another context earlier, I think about, I don't know, was it the movie Innocence in 1916 with the Odessa Steps sequence of just this hysteria and, just when somebody's child is crying and people are running and people with top hats and people with derbies are together and there's a storm happening which was not which was not happening, and the breakup part of the ship is occurring when it's at a very, very steep angle, and it's a bright red light that's coming across. But people were so appreciative that finally, instead of perpetuating this myth that it had gone down intact, that this had it actually happened this way, even though it was kind of over dramatized for the sake of that movie. But that movie, what were the elements of it that really brought me into the story? For one, I almost feel like even though Cameron's movie came out a year later, whoever made the miniseries had ideas that were very similar to Cameron's ideas of just cross-class interaction, and there's really,
Well, those are the themes, right? But, if you look at similarities between the 1953 Titanic movie, and of course A Night to Remember, and Cameron's 1997 movie, there are a lot of common elements about, like, the woman, falling off, right between 10 and then being pulled in by somebody on a deck and being brought back up, and that's because that was research that was done by Walter Lord, and so those things actually did happen. That's why they're common to several things.
When Cameron's film came out, I know that there was a review or two. It wasn't the LA Times. I know Kenneth Turan of the LA Times hated Cameron's Titanic. And then it might have been Time magazine. A female critic was very critical of the film because she said that it just lifted lines in parts without attribution from A Night to Remember. And so to your point about 96 Titanic, the miniseries with Zeta Jones having a lot in common with the 97 film, maybe that was also borrowing from and honoring.
Could be.
Honoring, do we want to call it honoring? Do we want to call it plagiarism on some level? I mean, it definitely admired the 1958 movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, I guess, to know. I as a person who, I mean, my family's often misrepresented, things are misquoted, birth dates are wrong, last names are wrong. I mean, so much is wrong in the books, what lifeboat they got into, different things. And it's weird with the Titanic, it seems like somebody utters something, whether that was in 1912, 1916, 1920, 1941, whenever it was said. And it's printed in a book, so therefore it's true. And then people take and they just, quote that book.
Right. Yeah.
And it's wrong, and there are things that are so incorrect about the Titanic. And I was talking to Bill Wormstead about this, that there still is a lot of things to be learned that are more accurate. And I think, I say this to you again, one of my books that I really love is Honesty of Glass, because they really go to those primary sources and they state where they got everything. And so the provenance of everything. And that's important moving forward, that people should do that so they can dispel some of these myths, and try to get, to honor the story. I mean, come on, this is, people need to, at some point, see it as a real tragedy and honor it by trying to get the facts correct and not just what they read in a book of which the information has no provenance. We don't know where it came from.
Right, and what's so funny to me is how some of the cinematic tellings of the story, televised tellings of the story, dramatized tellings, they are comfortable fictionalizing and adding, new characters to the story, and yet they also insist upon portraying real people but misattributing actions to those real people. If you are not sure that something actually happened, or that this character represents this action, then why even try to portray the real person in the story?
Cameron is a Titanic. I mean,
although also I love the film. I mean, it changed my life in many ways.
Yes, but he did the research, and a lot of the reasons it was similar was because he chose to use Walter Lord's research, which in my opinion is still some of the best research available. Now, have new discoveries been made? Of course. I mean, absolutely. But that's why they're similar. They're not plagiarized. They're actually more accurate.
Yeah, it's an ethnography. I mean, it's an oral history.
Right.
I mean, you just made a really good point. They were not borrowing from the movie A Night to Remember. They were borrowing from the
Walter
book
Lord's,
A Night to Remember, which was
research.
The movie was a very good adaptation of the book. Although the movie, and this is something that makes me still kind of hunger for other movies about the ship. The movie A Night to Remember makes a lot of the characters, or a lot of the historical figures, anonymous. This man says, the boy's only 13, of course he goes with his mother.
Right,
and
Rhoda Abbott's son.
The story, well, that one is, they didn't get to go. That was actually A.L. Ryerson and John Laurie Ryerson.
That's right.
I mean, there are the two movies that really, I think, made a very deliberate effort to portray real people and, across classes. Well, I mean, the first one I would say that really made the effort is the 1970s miniseries SOS Titanic.
Okay, yeah.
Which the sets are extremely inaccurate.
Right.
And of course the
Is
characterization
that Debbie Reynolds?
of,
Was it?
that's actually Cloris Leachman who
Oh,
played
Cloris
Molly
Leachman.
Brown,
That's right.
or they called her Molly Brown in that movie. Portrayed Margaret Brown in 1978 or 77, one year in the late 70s, and also portrayed her in the 1950s, long before she won an Oscar for whatever the name of the movie is. That one, and then the 2012 miniseries from the guy behind. Was he involved in Downton Abbey, or I know he had some role. He was the director,
an actor or a director
of Gosford Park.
Okay.
Have you seen the 2012 miniseries? It's
maybe,
4
but
parts.
But these are all available.
These are available.
On the, so please,
the 2012
go watch them.
one, I don't know that it's on YouTube, but you can definitely rent episodes or buy episodes for a very nominal amount on a certain other very popular website.
Yeah.
Who was portrayed in it? Dorothy Gibson, Eleanor Whitener, Marion Thayer, Jack Thayer.
Yeah, Dorothy Gibson was probably, she was a silent film actress and was considered to be the very first person who ever made a movie about the Titanic a week or 10 days after.
And in total, wore the outfit that she wore.
Right,
she was
exact
despite
outfit.
having been in a total, it was a traumatic event for her, for sure, but somehow, I think because she was under so much pressure to keep making movies, she was actually, the reason why she was traveling on the Titanic was, though she had been on a vacation that she needed to be very long, to escape the stress of work and just really think about what she wanted to do next. She was called back to make more movies, by a producer there who I think was also her romantic partner, and so she raced back home, but was on the Titanic, and that was what they said. Well, since you had this experience, let's make a movie about. Let's keep exploiting you.
Yeah, I think that really was an exploitation movie, and I think it's lost, isn't it?
It is lost, but recently
some stills, I think,
some stills were resurfaced, and then also another movie with Dorothy Gibson recently.
Oh, really?
Resurfaced. So
about the Titanic?
Not about the Titanic.
Okay.
But at least we get to see what she looked like.
Oh, I did see that. It was like a train race.
I don't know if it was.
I saw that.
I feel like it was a year before Titanic.
It might have been, but
afterwards.
it was yes. That I had seen on Facebook, and so I will try to find the name of that and insert that in here, because that can be seen too. So you can kind of get a sense of Dorothy Gibson. I believe it was silent, but you can see.
Oh yeah, she I don't know when her career in film ended, or I'm still processing her later life experience, with Nazi Germany and her identification with I don't know if it was just fascism in general or with Nazism, specifically in her time in the concentration camp. But she's another one who met a tragic end, did not get to be very old. I think her mother, Pauline, who was in the ship, might have outlived her. I think, I'm not sure. But I know, she is one of the many divas of the Titanic who had been subjects of biographies of their own. There's one that I bought recently that I've really enjoyed is Broadway Dane.
That's an excellent book. In fact, Randy Bingham, who it's awesome. He's also done a book about Lady Duff Gordon. And
I think he's working on one about Madeline Astor.
Oh, really? That
which
could
is
be
interesting
awesome.
Because in general, Randy likes to write about women who worked. He finds the struggle of women to build careers early in the 20th century to be especially fascinating.
Yeah.
I said to him, you should write a book about Lucille Carter.
And
because I think she's just, some cold things to say to people. And I mean, I personally find her just really fascinating.
Yeah.
But he said, I don't want to do that because, socialites, women who mostly led lives of leisure, it just doesn't interest me as much as women who really had to forge and innovate.
He also is a fashion historian, and so his book, on
Lady Duff Gordon.
Lady Duff Gordon. I mean, it really details, her artistry in terms of being this incredible, what would you call her? Clothier. I mean, in these fancy, beautiful.
And then there's
garments.
the through line between Lady Duff Gordon and Renee Harris, friends and frenemies.
Frenemies, yeah.
Those are perfect companion books about, Madeline, I think, though, to my knowledge, she never had a career. She spent so much time in relationships with men who had very, demanding careers that in turn demanded a lot of her. First lady of different industries and professions.
Well, she also had the relationship she had with, I guess, Fieri, I mean,
it was so abusive. Yeah.
It was so abusive, and he was a boxer, and maybe even physically abusive, which is horrible to think about. But as another woman who had a very tragic life and
it's funny
did not go well.
Yeah, that she went from being kind of ostracized for being the hot young thing who was
married
after
J.J.
this older
Astor.
man,
Right.
To being considered a cougar who was after younger men.
Right.
Just a woman can never get away from the labels that people want to apply to them, and especially then. I mean,
she was an
in
heiress.
her 40s anyway.
She was an heiress in her own right. I mean, yes, she did marry John Jacob Astor, and of course, as such, was the richest woman on the Titanic. And of course, she was 5 months pregnant with his
and she was
baby.
given that stipulation in his will.
You have to never marry.
In
Yeah.
order to keep this money coming or to get this money. I mean, I think it's obviously that worked out as it did. But what I find so fascinating is, I visit a lot of cemeteries to, all over the country, outside of the country as well, to see the graves or, crypts, mausoleums of Titanic survivors and, victims. And she is in that cemetery in New York with John Jacob Astor and his family, despite how her life progressed.
Well, she was still the mother of, his
Mother
children. Of Junior.
Although, I mean, she died in 1940.
I think they were somewhat estranged with her son.
I think so. I mean, I think they had a very volatile relationship, the one that she was pregnant with on the ship. But she died in 1940. He died in 92. And so for her to still, I'm not sure of what the family politics were of that interment, but for her to be in a relatively small, it is a very small cemetery.
It's in the Trinity Church, I think, right?
It's in Manhattan, it's just very easy to work your way through it.
Right.
I mean, the same with the cemetery where the Thayers and the Cassettes are, like a very small cemetery with, a lot of esteemed people from that era in it. But I mean, she's there and, whatever. I don't know if that meant that she really felt the most passion for him, or if somebody decided, this is who your one true love was, or what the thing was. But that's where she rests. The son, is he there? Or I think he died in Palm Beach for some reason.
I don't know where Junior is buried. It's interesting though, because he, for some reason, I'm kind of into dates and numerology, but not terribly. But he was born on August 14th, 1912, and that's important because he shares a birth date with my mentor, and one of the greatest pedagogues in flute. I'm a classical flutist, and so my mentor and major teacher was Louis Moïse, and he was born on August 14th, 1912, along with J.J. Astor Jr.
And so there's a definite spiritual or cosmic, or
Oh, absolutely,
like some connection there
Yeah.
that transcends what is natural and easy.
Well, and this is my great grandfather's mother, who was so tortured, and finally, after all this tragedy and whatever, his son or her son, my great granddad, was finally able to get her and her 3 youngest children over to the U.S., but it wasn't until 1915, and they came over on the Cymric, which is somewhat of a famous steamship, and that had to be so outrageous. Think about it. Think about my family in steamships, right? And that was, the Lusitania was sunk in May of 1915. And he put his mother on, he finally got his mother to this country, whether it was in the middle of the First World War on a steamship right after the Lusitania, and she came over on the Cymric, and finally, with her 3 youngest children, Pearl or Polly, Rose, who eventually married a man named Jack, so I have a real life Jack and Rose in my family, and Morris. And saddest thing, she died on August 14th of the next year.
Wow.
So she only lived 10 more months, and she was only like 49 years old. I mean, what a hard life, going through those horrible pogroms and ethnic violence towards Jews, and in Poland, or what was then Russia, and losing her husband to it, and then going through all of this turmoil. I mean, I can't even imagine stepping on a steamship after my son had come over, been kicked out, had to come back on a different steamship, and then his wife comes over, well, most of the way over, on the Titanic, and then the Lusitania sinks, and she gets on a boat a couple months later in the middle of World War I. And then after all that,
way to get to these places.
She
fly.
dies after only 10 months, on August 14th.